One can only surmise that perhaps the three of them had stolen some drugs, failed to pay a debt that they owed to this other person, or indeed had probably, in Tate's instance, become too violent or too extreme that he was thought to be dangerous, and they just wanted to take him out of the situation.
Then Dibley got his first break. It took a while for it to dawn on Donna Jaggers that she might hold a clue to tracking down Rolf's killers. Her first instinct had been to protect herself and their child, to ensure she said as little as possible for fear of implicating herself. She had after all been there when Kevin Whitaker was killed. She'd been present at many of Rolf's drug deals, and she'd witnessed firsthand the increasing tension between members of the gang in the weeks leading up to the killings. Most of all, she knew that Rolf and the others had been on their way to meet the man she knew only as Mickey the Pilot on the night they died. Soon after the press conference, she made a new statement explaining everything she knew. It was less than 36 hours after the murder, and Dibley now had the name of his prime suspect. All he had to do now was find out who Mickey the Pilot actually was. I didn't know who or what I was dealing with, so I wanted to keep things pretty close to my chest. I was in the canteen at the police headquarters when I saw a friend who worked in the criminal intelligence. "You don't happen to know a pilot called Mickey?" I asked him. He said that he did. "Alright, listen, at some stage you think you could let me have whatever you've got on him?" He said he was just on his way to the office and that he'd get it for him then and there. This was just what I wanted. I didn't even have to wait a week or even a weekend, but I had to make it look as casual as possible. As soon as Dibley saw the details of Steele's previous convictions, a possible motive for the killings, a drugs-related double-cross, became clear. But for the theory to work, there had to be some firm connection between Steele and the dead men. Did they live near each other? Did they ever work together? Did they socialise together? Did their girlfriends know each other? It was like working on a 1,000-piece jigsaw when you only have 50 pieces. Even if the stuff you have is all in the right place, it's still not making a picture at all. It's easy looking back with hindsight. You just think, well, they're all in prison together, it's obvious. But at the time, that's just one of dozens of possibilities. Everything you do in these early stages is pure guesswork. Even having an idea at where to look is no guarantee of success. Checking whether prisoners have served time together is no easy task, even for the police. Chelmsford Prison, for example, has 40 movements per day. Records are not always kept, and even if you find two prisoners in the same jail at the same time, you still need confirmation from staff or other prisoners before you can say for sure that they actually knew each other, particularly if they were serving on different wings. With neither Tucker or Rolf having served much time, the connections with Steele had to be through Tate. And once it was established that the pair had been banged up together at Swellside Prison through most of 1992, another clue was on the table. If Steele knew Tate best, then it might have been Tate's behaviour that led to his death. Bill Davidson knew Michael Steele of old. A long-serving member of the National Investigation Service of Customs and Excise, he'd been one of the leading lights between Operation Waterski, the largest customs investigation that had resulted in Steele being sent to prison in 1989. After hearing of his release on parole in 1994, Davidson knew it was only a matter of time before Steele tried to get back into the game. It was nothing more than a hunch based on Steele's love of smuggling for the adrenaline kick as much as for the money. So there was nothing to justify a surveillance operation there and then. But Davidson carefully ensured that any odd bits of information that related to Steele, his activities, his associates, were compiled and coordinated on a regular basis. Davidson's hunch was proved right when Steele was arrested along with Wilmes and Corey at Felixstowe Ferry in November 1995. Although there hadn't been enough evidence to press charges, it was blindingly obvious what the trio had been up to. A boatload of cannabis had brought over from Belgium, landed somewhere on the Essex or Suffolk coast, and then Steele had gone back out to sea and brought his boat back in at the marina. When the boat was finally returned to Jack Wilmes, it was after all he who said he owned it. Davidson learned it was being stored at a garage at G&T Commercials, the dockside haulage company in Ipswich where Wilmes worked as a freelance mechanic, looking after the company's vehicles. The boat was clearly the key to Steele's smuggling activities, so Davidson decided to assign a team to keep the premises under watch and issue an alert to ports and airports to look out for any new trips abroad. The first few weeks yielded little interest as far as the boat was concerned. Though a report from Harwich said that Steele had made a ferry trip to the Hook of Holland along with Darren Nichols, around the 15th of November. A few days after the Rettendon murders, Davison was preparing to submit the plans to his superiors, asking for the operation to be stepped up when a call came in from the Essex police, explaining that Michael Steele was the number one suspect in the triple killings. An urgent meeting was arranged, and it was quickly agreed that the police investigation should take priority, and that they would put Steele and some of his associates under round-the-clock surveillance. If the police came across anything that indicated the target was planning another smuggling trip, Customs would immediately be brought in. By the same token, Customs agreed to pass on all their information about Steele and his associates and keep the police informed of any movements through ports and airports. Less than 2 weeks after Steele had committed what he considered to be a near-perfect murder, the net was starting to close in. For a man accused of a gruesome triple murder and said to be involved in drug smuggling on a massive scale, Michael Steele seemed to be living a life that would bore a hermit. Dibley's men watched him go into the shops, pottering around in the grounds of his home, going out for the odd meal with Jackie Street, visiting his ex-girlfriend or sister-in-law, visiting Sarah Saunders, and then pottering around once again. Yet despite finding nothing out of the ordinary, Dibley found himself under enormous pressure to arrest Steele there and then. A lot of people in my team were saying that the gun that had been used for the murders would be in a case above the mantelpiece in his house. They reckoned it would be a real trophy, and they'd definitely hang on to it. All we had to do was raid him, and the case would be solved. I didn't agree. From what I knew of Steele, he was much too clever to have anything like that lying around. The clothes, the shoes, the guns, anything that could link into a murder would have been destroyed almost immediately. If we'd have picked him up, he would have sat on his hands and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." No comment all the way. It was too risky to even contemplate. The only possible advantage we had was that Steele had no idea we were onto him. An arrest would spoil all that. My bosses would have loved to have brought him in. The press would have loved it. The families of the dead men would have loved it. But the time just wasn't right. Instead, Dibley decided to let the job run long term, doing nothing more proactive than watching, waiting, and building up a picture of Steele's gang. Williams and Corey had already been identified as key members of Steele's smuggling team by Customs, but that didn't mean they were involved in the murder. Dibley, however, was convinced that Steele had not acted alone. The way I saw it, Steele couldn't have been on his own, because there was no way he would have risked getting into the Range Rover with a gun. Even if it was a sawn-off, then it would have still been bulging out under his raincoat or trouser leg. It would have been really obvious. And even if he did find a way of concealing it, he'd have never been able to get it out quickly enough to take out all three men by surprise. There had to be at least two killers, Steele in the car itself, and another man hiding in the bushes down the lane with two guns. That way, as Steele got out of the car, the other man could hand him a gun and then lean in and start shooting. I also felt there had to be at least one more person involved because of the question of transportation to and from the murder scene. Steele was easy. It arrived in the Range Rover, but what about the other man? He would have been hiding down the lane for a while, at least half an hour. Would he risk parking his own car somewhere nearby or down the lane itself? Unlikely. It was only a small risk, but if a member of the public, or worse still a policeman, saw it, thought it was suspicious and made a note of the number, then it would all be over. There's also the question of your state of mind after you've done something like that. No matter how cold and unemotional you are, you wouldn't want to do anything to draw attention to yourself as you're driving away from the murder scene. The only possible solution was to have a third member of the gang parked up somewhere and have them pick Steele and the other killer up once the deed was done. Dibley took his theory one step further. He predicted that when an arrest was eventually made, it would be the getaway driver who would prove to be the weak link. Whether he knew the killings were about to take place or not, he would have taken no actual part in it. He would have had to be away from the scene, and would therefore do everything he could to distance himself from the actual crime. If anybody was going to talk, it would be him. It was less than 10 days after the murder, and Dibley, in an astonishing bit of classic detective work, had managed to work out exactly what had happened, and pretty much who was responsible. And he didn't have a single scrap of evidence to prove it. Just before Christmas, a member of Dibley's team pulled him to one side and asked him how much he knew about the way mobile phones work. Dibley admitted he didn't know that much and asked why. The man explained that whenever a mobile phone is switched on, it automatically sends a signal to the nearest radio beacon, so that the network knows where the phone is. The information is instantly transferred to a central computer. When a call comes in from that particular phone, it is sent out via the same beacon. If a phone moves out of a particular area, it continues sending out signals until it is picked up from the next nearest beacon. The man could see his boss's eyes were starting to glaze over, so he quickly got to the point. If Steele and his accomplices had had their mobile phones with them on the day of the murder, then they would have logged on to the beacon nearest to Workhouse Lane at some point that evening. They'd be able to see what time Steele got there, what time he left, and who he was with. They'd be able to check his movements earlier in the day, as well as see who he was in contact with, and compare them to the movements of Tate, Tucker and Rolfe. It sounded brilliant, almost too good to be true. I asked him what he'd need to compile the information, and he scratched his chin for a second, then said just a couple of computer terminals and a corner of the incident room. I told him to go for it and keep me informed on a daily basis. It took a few weeks to track down all the different sources of information and work out the best way of putting it all together, but when the first printouts emerged, they were beyond Dibley's wildest expectations. You couldn't see the people, and you couldn't hear what was being said, but you could follow everyone's movements, or to be more exact, the movements of their phones, throughout the day, and see all the different sides slowly coming together, and ended up at Workhouse Lane. It was incredible. It all started around 2 p.m. with a call from Steele's landline to Nichols's mobile, which was at the time out in Sunbury on the site close to Heathrow. 11 minutes later, Steele called Womes at G&T in Ipswich. Soon after that, there were calls from a payphone at the Sorrel House Inn, a pub just down the road from G&T, to Tucker's mobile, and then Tate's mobile, as Womes started arranging the meeting for that evening. The call to Tate's mobile was brief and followed a few minutes later by a much longer call to a payphone close to Tate's house, an attempt to get around any bugging devices that may have been planted. After that, there was a series of calls between Steele and Nichols, with the latter getting even closer to Essex, until both his phone and Steele's connected with the beacon nearest to Marks Tay. At 6:44 p.m, Tate's mobile received a call from the landline belonging to Sarah Saunders. At 1 minute to 7, Womes' mobile connected to the beacon nearest Workhouse Lane for a 3-second call to the mobile of Darren Nichols, as he asked to be picked up from the murder scene. Although no calls had been made or received by Steele's phone during the time the murders were believed to have taken place, the printout showed that it too had logged itself onto the beacon nearest Workhouse Lane around the critical time. The phone records not only fingered Steele and Womes as the killers and Nichols as the getaway driver, but also put Corey in the clear. When he sat down and looked at it all, it seemed to be pretty damning evidence, but as far as I was concerned, it didn't change a thing, says Dibley. The pressure to arrest Steele was on again, and all he would have said was that he didn't have his phone with him that day. His wife borrowed it, and he went out on a drive around Essex. It wasn't enough to prove anything different, so all we could do was add it to the pot and continue with the long-term plan. It was another piece of the jigsaw, but the picture was still far from complete. In fact, short of getting Steele to throw his hands up and shout out, "I did it, it was me all along," there didn't seem to be any way to close the case. But we had to keep going. The alternative is you pack up your bags and say, "We think he's done it, but we can't prove it, so let's just leave it." And that would have suited a lot of people. All the time I was being asked, "What are you worried about? Why are you wasting your time on this scum? Whoever done this has done the whole population a favour." It was on the evening of Thursday the 15th of February 1996, shortly after the 9 p.m. news had come on the air, that a relaxed and confident Michael Steele received the first telephone call. The voice was not one that he recognised, but Steele listened patiently as the softly spoken Irishman on the other end of the line explained that he'd been trying to track him down for several weeks, along with his brother John. The caller Billy had been part of an organisation working closely with Pat Tate. Unbeknown to Steele, all the merchandise that had been shipping into the country and passing on to Tate had eventually made its way to the Emerald Isle. When the enterprise started up, Billy and John had been led to believe that the fresh supplies would be reaching them on a regular basis, and with that in mind, they'd invested a good deal of their own money into the venture to ensure its smooth operation. But now with Tate dead, the brothers had suddenly found themselves out of pocket and out of stock. Everybody had assumed that Tate was working with the Joneses. Perhaps Billy and John were linked to them. The initial request was simple enough. Would Steele be willing to supply the same goods at the same bargain price Tate had offered to them directly? If that wasn't possible, then how about delivering the goods at a reduced rate to a local third party whom they would nominate? or if Steele himself had a suggestion for the best way to do business, they would be more than happy to listen. Up until that point, Steele had said nothing more than hello. He'd held his silence for a moment longer, but when he finally chose to speak again, he chose his words carefully. "I haven't got the faintest idea what you're talking about, mate," he said, and promptly put the phone down. The second call came 2 days later, and the first threat followed almost immediately. "Pat owed us £40,000, said Billy, the voice having suddenly developed a much harder edge. "We want our fucking money. Where is it? This isn't some game." Even under pressure, Steele remained the epitome of cool. "I think the police have got it. Why don't you talk to them?" he said, and promptly put the phone down. After that, it all started to fall apart. "Don't fuck with us, Mickey," hissed John the following evening. "We want our money, or you'll be sorted out just like Pat was." Steele had to stifle a giggle. The idea of someone threatening him with the same fate as Pat, under the circumstances, so ludicrous it almost brought tears to his eyes. Over the next week or so, the calls became more and more frequent, and Billy and John made more and more references to the end of the IRA ceasefire and the bombing of Canary Wharf. The implication was obvious, but Steele wasn't going to be pushed around by anyone. The threats became even more direct. "You're going to have to emigrate," Billy told him one day. "That's the only way. I'm going to have to follow these matters up. And watch your car. I have A-levels in whacking people." Steele's response was curt and to the point. "I've told you, I don't know what you're talking about. Why don't the pair of you just fuck off and bother someone else?" Billy just laughed. "You better watch your back. The ceasefire's gone, Mickey, and your ceasefire's gone." A few days later, a tearful Sarah Saunders called Steele. Billy and John had taken him at his word and called her up to make similar threats. Saunders, unaware at first that Steele had also been contacted by the brothers, had gone straight to the Basildon police with a phone number they'd given her. Their response did little to comfort her. Not only had the number been traced to a well-known Republican bar in Belfast, but Billy and John, both identified as known members of a major terrorist cell, had recently travelled to the mainland. They'd been tracked entering the port, but the special agents tailing them had now lost track. No one knew where they were. Saunders was terrified, but Steele was full of doubts. Would terrorists really hold him responsible for the £40,000? Could they have been dealing with someone as unreliable and as unpredictable as Tate? Would they really be phoning him up and threatening him so openly on the phone? None of it made sense. He took a gamble and did nothing. And almost as soon as they had started, the phone call stopped. "It's bollocks," he told Darry Nichols. "I reckon it's probably the old Bill or someone."